Smile, Marie. Each tear you shed is worth $10,000 to the man sitting across from you. The words didn't make sense. Marie Turner looked up from her untouched plate of food she couldn't identify, her throat tight with confusion. Eric Helborn sat across from her at the obsidian table, his smile sharp as a scalpel. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering cityscape 50 stories below. But it was the other men in the room who made her stomach drop. They weren't eating either. They were watching. 5 men in suits that cost more than her yearly salary, scattered around the glass boardroom like wolves circling wounded prey. One of them, a silver-haired executive she recognized from the quarterly meetings, held up his phone. The red recording light blinked once, twice. Marie's chest constricted. I don't understand. Don't you? Eric leaned back, swirling his wine. Let me clarify. We're running a little experiment tonight. Every time you cry, every time you beg, every time that pretty little mask cracks, someone here makes money. Real money. Think of it as performance art meets venture capital. The man with the phone laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Another checked his smart watch, lips moving as he calculated something. Marie's hands began to shake. This wasn't a bonus dinner. This wasn't the exclusive corporate opportunity Eric had promised. This was something else entirely, something inhuman. It had started 6 hours earlier, when hope still felt possible. Marie had been at her mother's bedside in County General, watching machines breathe for the woman who'd raised her alone. Stage 4. Inoperable. The doctors spoke in clinical distances, months, maybe weeks, while the bills piled up like tombstones. $50,000 for treatment that would buy time but not survival. Marie's savings had been drained weeks ago. Her phone had buzzed. Eric Helborn. Her boss, the tech billionaire who'd built his empire on apps that monetized human attention spans. He rarely called directly. Marie, I have a proposition. Tonight, a private dinner with some potential investors. I need someone sharp, someone who understands the human element of what we do. Come prepared to impress, and I'll make sure your mother gets the treatment she needs. All of it, paid in full. She'd nearly dropped the phone. Mr. Helborn, 8 p.m. The Meridian Building, penthouse level. Don't be late. This is your one chance to prove you're more than just another expendable employee. The line went dead before she could ask questions, before she could hear the trap snap shut. Marie had stood in her mother's hospital room, staring at the machines that demanded $50,000 to keep breathing. What choice did she have? She'd kissed her mother's papery forehead and whispered a promise. I'll fix this. I'll save you. She'd gone home to the studio apartment she could barely afford, pulled out the one professional dress she owned, a simple black sheath with a torn hem she'd stitched herself, and practiced smiling in the mirror. Practiced being valuable. Practiced being someone worth investing in. On the cab ride to the Meridian Building, she'd allowed herself 3 minutes of fantasy. Maybe this was real. Maybe Eric had seen something in her, some spark of worth. Maybe tonight she would become the kind of person who didn't have to choose between rent and her mother's medication. The penthouse elevator had opened directly into the boardroom. No reception area. No escape route. Just that terrible black table, those men in their perfect suits, and Eric's smile that never quite reached his eyes. Marie, right on time. Gentlemen, our guest of honor has arrived. Now, in this moment of crystalline horror, Marie understood. The empty chair, the single-place setting, the way they'd positioned her with her back to the windows, facing the room like an actress on a stage. Eric pulled out his own phone, angling it toward her face. Let's start with something simple. Tell us about your mother. Tell us what you do to save her. And Marie, his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. Remember that your pain is the only currency that matters here tonight. One of the men adjusted his position, and Marie saw the betting pool displayed on a tablet screen. Time to first tears, 5 minutes. Time to begging, 12 minutes. Time to complete breakdown, 20 minutes. Before we go any further, pause here for a moment. If Marie's pain disturbed you, like this video, subscribe for stories where power is finally confronted. And comment below, What should happen to men who turn suffering into a game? She opened her mouth to scream, to run, to do anything but play their game. That's when the windows began to vibrate. A sound, so low it was almost subliminal, rattled through the glass. The city lights beyond flickered, then went dark section by section, as if something vast was swallowing the electricity itself. Lightning split the sky, not natural, too precise, too deliberate, and in that flash of white-blue light, Marie saw him. A figure stood behind Eric, reflected in the black mirror of the window. Tall, impossibly still. A man in an immaculate black suit with features too perfect to be human, his pale skin luminous against the storm-dark sky. Long, dark hair pulled back. Eyes that caught the lightning and held it. He hadn't been there a second ago. Marie was certain of it. The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath misted in the air. Ice crystals formed on the wine glasses. Eric was still talking, still smiling, oblivious to the presence behind him. Now, Marie, let's discuss the terms of your humiliation. A hand, elegant and pale as marble, settled on Eric Helborn's shoulder. Gentlemen, a voice said, soft as silk and cold as the grave, I believe you've begun the entertainment without me. Every man in the room froze. Eric's smile finally died. 3 days before the dinner, Marie had been invisible. She moved through the glass corridors of Helborn Technologies like a ghost, carrying her tablet and coffee in a careful ballet designed not to disturb the important people. The executives who made decisions, the developers who built empires, the investors who turned ideas into gold. Marie was none of these things. She was administrative support, a title that meant she scheduled meetings for people who earned in an hour what she made in a year. Her cubicle was in the back corner of the 14th floor, wedged between the copy room and the emergency exit. No window, no nameplate, just a desk with a dying plant she kept forgetting to water and a framed photo of her mother from before the cancer had hollowed her out. That morning, Marie had been updating spreadsheets when her phone rang with an internal extension she didn't recognize. Top floor, executive suite. Miss Turner, Mr. Helborn would like to see you immediately. The assistant's voice was crisp, vaguely annoyed, as if Marie should have anticipated this summons. Her hands went cold. In 3 years at Helborn Technologies, she'd seen Eric Helborn exactly twice. Once at the company holiday party where he'd given a speech about disruption and innovation, and once in an elevator where he'd looked through her as if she were made of air. Men like Eric Helborn didn't summon women like Marie Turner, not unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. The elevator ride to the 60th floor felt like ascending to judgment. Marie checked her reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to smooth her hair, her discount blouse, her entire existence into something presentable. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of white marble. Everything gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that only unlimited money could buy. Eric's office occupied the entire corner of the building. Windows on 2 sides framed the city like a conquered kingdom. He sat behind a desk of black glass, typing on a laptop so thin it seemed impossible. He didn't look up when she entered. Marie stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, until he finally acknowledged her presence with a glance that lasted exactly 1 second. Marie Turner, you've been with us how long? 3 years, Mr. Helborn. 3 years. He said it like he was tasting something mildly unpleasant. And in that time, you've been adequate, punctual, unremarkable, the kind of employee who exists in the margins of a company like mine. He closed the laptop with a soft click. Tell me, Marie, what would you do for $50,000? The number hit her like a physical blow. 50,000. The exact amount she needed. The exact amount she'd been crying about in bathroom stalls and during sleepless nights. The exact amount that stood between her mother and an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. I would do anything, she heard herself say, and hated how desperate it sounded. Eric smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd heard exactly what he wanted to hear. Anything, what a dangerous word. He stood, moving to the windows, hands in his pockets. I have a dinner, 3 days from now, very exclusive, very private, Some potential investors who need to be impressed, convinced that Hellborn Technologies understands the human element of what we do. Marie's mind raced. A dinner with investors. This was beyond her qualifications, beyond her clearance level, beyond anything that made sense. Mr. Hellborn, I'm not sure I understand what you need from me. I need someone real, Marie. Someone who hasn't been polished smooth by too much money. Someone who can be authentic. He turned to face her, and his eyes were flat like a shark's eyes. You'll attend as my guest, wear something appropriate, be yourself. Answer their questions honestly, make them believe in the product. And you'll pay me $50,000 for one dinner. I'll pay your mother's medical bills, all of them. The treatment, the hospital stay, the medications, everything. I'll have my lawyers draft the papers today. He moved back to his desk, already dismissing her. Consider it a performance bonus. All you have to do is show up and be human for a few hours. Can you manage that, Miss Turner? She should have heard the trap in those words. Should have questioned why a billionaire would pay a fortune for her to simply be herself at a dinner. Should have asked what he really meant by performance and authentic and human. But all she could see was her mother's face, gray against white hospital sheets. All she could hear was the doctor's voice explaining that without treatment, they were looking at weeks, not months. All she could feel was the crushing weight of powerlessness that had been suffocating her since the diagnosis. Yes, Marie said, I can manage that. Excellent. Eric pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. I've just sent you the details. The Meridian Building, penthouse level, 8 p.m. this Friday. Don't be late, Marie. Opportunities like this don't come twice. She left his office in a daze, rode the elevator down to her forgotten corner of the building, and sat at her desk staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. An email from Eric's legal team. A contract promising payment of all medical expenses for Lydia Turner upon successful completion of services rendered at the investor dinner. Services rendered. The phrase should have set off alarms, should have made her pause, question, investigate. Instead, Marie signed the electronic document with trembling fingers and felt something that had been absent for months. Hope. That afternoon, she went to the hospital and told her mother everything. Well, almost everything. She described the dinner, the opportunity, the miracle of Eric Hellborn's generosity. She edited out her own confusion, her nagging sense that something about the offer felt wrong. Her mother, too weak to sit up, had squeezed her hand. My beautiful girl, you've always been so much stronger than you know. Marie had smiled and lied and promised that everything would be fine. She'd kissed her mother's forehead and walked out into the fading daylight, already rehearsing what she would say to these mysterious investors, already imagining how she would be charming and authentic and human enough to earn her mother's life. She never once considered that human was exactly what they wanted, that her authenticity was the product, that the dinner wasn't an opportunity at all, but an execution dressed in expensive wine and cruelty. 3 days later, she would step into that elevator to the penthouse and understand too late that some invitations are written in blood and signed with souls. The elevator to the penthouse had no buttons. Marie stepped inside the polished steel cage at exactly 7:58 p.m., her cheap heels clicking against marble that probably cost more than her car. The doors whispered shut behind her with the kind of engineered silence that spoke of wealth beyond comprehension. She'd expected a panel of numbers, a way to control her ascent, but there was nothing. Just mirrors on 3 sides reflecting her nervous face back at her in triplicate, and a small camera lens in the upper corner, watching. The elevator knew where she was going, or rather, someone else did. She'd spent 2 hours getting ready in her studio apartment, trying on the same black dress 3 times, applying makeup with shaking hands, rehearsing introductions in the mirror. Hello, I'm Marie Turner. It's a pleasure to meet you. Too formal. Hi, I'm Marie. Too casual. She'd settled on a smile and a firm handshake, the kind of confident presentation she'd seen in TED Talks about making good first impressions. Now, rising through the spine of the Meridian Building, watching the floor numbers climb in red digital increments, Marie felt the first whisper of something wrong. The elevator didn't stop at the 50th floor, or the 55th, or the 60th. It climbed past them all, into levels she didn't know existed, past the point where normal business was conducted. Higher, always higher, until the numbers stopped making sense and there was only the letter P glowing like a warning. Penthouse. The doors opened onto a private vestibule of black marble and recessed lighting. No reception desk, no other doors, just a single entrance of frosted glass ahead of her, and silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Marie stepped out, and the elevator immediately descended, taking her escape route with it. She was committed now. Through the frosted glass, she could see shapes moving, silhouettes of people. She heard laughter, the kind that came easy to those who'd never worried about money. Marie smoothed her dress one final time, lifted her chin, and pushed through the door into the boardroom. The first thing she noticed was the cold, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. The kind of temperature designed to keep people alert, prevent them from relaxing. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around two walls, showcasing the city 50 stories below like a glittering carpet of conquered territory. The boardroom itself was all sharp angles and expensive minimalism. A long table of obsidian glass, chairs that looked sculptural rather than comfortable, and lighting that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The second thing she noticed was that there were no other women. 6 men occupied the space, all in suits that whispered of custom tailoring and old money. They turned to look at her as she entered, and Marie felt their gazes like physical touches, assessing, calculating, categorizing. None of them smiled. None of them moved to greet her. They simply watched as Eric Helborn detached himself from a conversation by the windows and approached. Marie, punctual as always. His voice was warm, but his eyes remained flat. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Turner, the guest I mentioned." Not colleague, not associate, guest, as if she were an attraction rather than a participant. The nearest man, silver-haired and deeply tanned, raised a glass of wine in acknowledgement. "Charming," he said, though whether he meant her or the situation itself wasn't clear. "Eric, you do know how to set a scene." Another man laughed, checking his watch with the casual precision of someone tracking investments. He was younger, maybe 40, with the kind of lean face that suggested he burned calories through stress and ambition. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Eric replied smoothly. "That we're investors interested in the human element." "And she believed you." This from a third man, heavyset and expensively groomed, who'd positioned himself near the bar. His tone suggested this was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Marie's stomach clenched. The way they spoke about her, as if she weren't standing right there, as if she were an object under glass rather than a person. She tried to salvage the situation with professionalism. "I'm here to answer any questions you might have about Helborn Technologies and our approach to user engagement." The silver-haired man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "User engagement, is that what we're calling it now?" More laughter, shared glances, an inside joke she wasn't part of. Marie looked to Eric for clarification, for some indication of what she was supposed to do, but he'd moved to the head of the table, already pouring wine into crystal glasses. "Please, Marie, sit." He gestured to a chair at the center of the table, facing the windows, facing the room, every other chair angled toward hers, an amphitheater with her as the stage. She sat because she didn't know what else to do, because $50,000 was waiting on the other side of this discomfort, because her mother needed her to be brave. The men took their positions around the table, but none of them sat across from her. They flanked her instead, creating a semicircle of expensive suits and calculated positioning. Eric remained standing at the head, backlit by the city beyond the glass. "Wine, Marie." He was already pouring, not waiting for her answer. Red, dark as blood, filling the glass in front of her. "I don't usually drink during business meetings," she said, trying to sound professional rather than terrified. "This isn't a business meeting." The silver-haired man leaned back in his chair, studying her like a specimen. "This is entertainment." The younger man pulled out his phone, angling it toward her. The camera lens stared like a black eye. "Eric, remind us of the parameters." Parameters, the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Marie's hands gripped the edge of the table. I don't understand. What parameters? Patience, Marie. Eric's voice had changed, losing its veneer of warmth. Now it was clinical, detached, the voice of a scientist preparing an experiment. We're establishing baselines. Gentlemen, everyone connected to the pool. Pool, connected, baselines. The words didn't make sense, but the way the men were looking at her did. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of the lone officer who denied her mother's treatment financing. In the faces of the hospital administrators who'd explained that compassion didn't override policy. In every interaction with the powerful who'd learned that people like Marie were fungible, replaceable, ultimately disposable. They didn't see a person sitting at this table. They saw a commodity, an asset to be leveraged, a number on a spreadsheet. The heavy-set man by the bar checked his tablet, nodding. We're live, streaming to the usual channels. Current odds are holding steady. Streaming, odds, Marie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I should go. Sit down, Marie. Eric's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade. We have a contract. Services rendered, remember. You haven't rendered anything yet. The elevator was gone. The door behind her seemed impossibly far. 6 men, none of them moving, all of them watching with the patient interest of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Marie sat, not because she wanted to, but because the weight of her mother's medical bills, the promise of salvation, the crushing architecture of her own desperation gave her no choice. Eric smiled and produced his phone, positioning it to capture her face. Now then, let's begin. Eric's phone was aimed at her face like a weapon. Let's start with something simple, he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a talk show host. Marie, tell us about your mother. The question landed wrong, too intimate for a business dinner, too personal for strangers. Marie's throat constricted. I don't see how that's relevant to Hellborn Technologies. Humor me. Eric's smile didn't waver. Your mother is sick, isn't she? Stage 4 cancer. Inoperable. The doctors gave her weeks, maybe months. He paused, letting the words settle like stones. How does that make you feel? The silver-haired man leaned forward, interested. The younger one adjusted his phone's angle. The heavy-set man near the bar tapped something on his tablet, and Marie heard a soft chime from multiple devices around the room. How did you? Marie's voice cracked. Her medical privacy, her mother's diagnosis, the private hell she'd been living through for 6 months. How did Eric know? Background checks are thorough when $50,000 is on the line. Eric circled behind her chair, his phone never leaving her face. You signed a contract, Marie. You agreed to be authentic, so be authentic. Tell these gentlemen what it's like to watch your mother die while you count pennies in the bargain bin at the grocery store. Heat flooded Marie's face. Shame, visceral and choking. She'd been so careful to keep her life private, to maintain the fiction that she was fine, that she was managing. The idea that Eric had been watching, documenting, cataloging her poverty like a scientist studying bacteria made her skin crawl. Odds are shifting, the heavy-set man announced, not bothering to lower his voice. First visible emotional response at minute 3, I had minute 5. Marie turned to stare at him. Odds. The younger man grinned, holding up his tablet so she could see the screen. A betting interface, sleek and professional with her name at the top. Below it, categories that made her stomach turn. Time to first tears, time to begging, time to complete breakdown. Each category had numbers next to it, money flowing in real time as people placed wagers on her suffering. We're streaming this to a very exclusive audience, Eric explained, moving back into her line of sight. Wealthy individuals who appreciate entertainment of a certain caliber. They're betting on how long it takes before you break, Marie. Before the mask of civility, you wear cracks wide open, and we see what's really underneath. This is insane. Marie pushed her chair back, tried to stand. I'm leaving. No, you're not. Eric's hand landed on her shoulder, gentle but firm, pressing her back down. Because if you leave, your mother's treatment gets canceled. The bills come due. County General stops being charitable and Lydia Turner dies in a hospice bed, drowning in her own fluids. Is that what you want? The cruelty of it stole her breath. The perfect trap. Stay and be humiliated, or leave and murder her mother through inaction. Marie's hands shook so violently she had to clutch them together in her lap. "Good girl," Eric murmured. "Now let's talk about your father." Marie's head snapped up. "Don't." "Michael Turner. Left when you were 7, never looked back. No child support, no birthday cards, nothing. Just vanished like you weren't worth the effort of remembering." Eric's voice was clinical, a doctor reciting symptoms. "Your mother worked 3 jobs to keep you fed. You wore second-hand clothes and learned to be invisible because being seen meant being pitied." Tears burned behind Marie's eyes. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But Eric kept talking, peeling back layers of her life like he was filleting a fish. "You got a scholarship to community college but dropped out after a year because your mother got sick the first time. Breast cancer, remission, then recurrence. You've been taking care of her ever since. No relationships, no friends, no life beyond work and hospital visits." He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "Tell me, Marie, do you ever resent her? Do you ever wish you could just let go?" "No," the word came out strangled. "I love my mother." "But you're exhausted, aren't you? Tired of being the good daughter, tired of sacrificing everything while the world keeps taking." Eric straightened, addressing the room. "Look at her face, gentlemen, see that? That's the moment a human being realizes they're worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for them. And in Marie's case, that's the cost of a few hours of entertainment." The tablet chimed again. "First tier," the heavy-set man called out. "Minute 7, congratulations to whoever had the under." Marie touched her cheek, felt the wetness there. She hadn't noticed she was crying. The realization that her own body had betrayed her, had given these monsters exactly what they wanted, broke something inside her chest. "Stop this," she whispered. "Please." "There it is." The younger man zoomed in with his phone. "The begging, that's going to spike the numbers." Eric returned to his seat across from her, finally lowering his phone. "Marie, I want you to understand something. This dinner was never about investing in hellborn technologies. This is about investing in human misery. These gentlemen and I, we have everything. Money, power, influence. The only thing that still entertains us is watching people like you realize how utterly powerless you are." The silver-haired man raised his wine glass. "To authenticity." The others joined him, crystal ringing against crystal, a toast to her degradation. Marie sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, her carefully rehearsed professionalism shattered beyond repair. She thought of her mother, alone in that hospital room, trusting her daughter to save her. She thought of the contract she'd signed, the trap she'd walked into with open eyes because desperation made fools of everyone. "Now," Eric continued, pulling out a leather folder, "let's discuss the real rules of tonight's game. Every question you refuse to answer costs you $5,000 from your mother's treatment fund. Every time you try to leave, another $5,000. Every time you stop crying, we escalate the content until you start again." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers. "I have documentation here of every shameful moment of your life. Every rejection, every failure, every private humiliation you thought no one knew about." Marie's vision blurred. The room tilted. This wasn't just cruelty. This was systematic destruction, engineered by men who'd turned human suffering into a spectator sport. The heavy-set man checked his tablet again. "We're at 12 minutes. Pool is getting interesting. Someone just wagered 6 figures on complete breakdown before minute 20. Then we'd better deliver." Eric leaned forward, his eyes glittering with something that wasn't quite human. "Marie, let's talk about the night your mother told you she wished you'd never been born." The words hit like a physical blow. That night, 3 years ago, when the pain medication had made her mother cruel and confused. When she'd said things she'd apologized for the next morning, things Marie had tried to forget. Things she'd never told anyone. Marie's mouth opened, a sound emerging that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of something breaking beyond repair, the noise a soul makes when it realizes there's no rescue coming. And that's when the windows began to shake. The vibrations started in the floor. Marie felt it through her shoes, a subsonic rumble that traveled up her spine like a warning. The wine glasses on the obsidian table began to hum, a crystalline note that rose in pitch until it became uncomfortable. The men paused mid-celebration, their laughter dying in their throats as they looked around for the source of the disturbance. "Earthquake," the younger man said, but his voice carried uncertainty. Earthquakes didn't announce themselves like this, didn't build with such deliberate intention. The city lights beyond the windows flickered. Once. Twice. Then entire blocks went dark, spreading outward from the Meridian building like a disease. Marie watched through her tears as the glittering carpet of civilization was consumed by shadow, section by section, until only the penthouse remained lit against an ocean of darkness. "What the hell is going on?" The heavy-set man moved toward the windows, his tablet forgotten. The whole grid just went down. Thunder rolled across the sky, but it was wrong. Too deep, too sustained, more like a growl than a natural sound. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously. Marie's breath misted in the air. Frost began to creep across the windows in delicate, geometric patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if winter itself was writing messages in ice. Eric stood, his phone still recording but his attention now divided. "It's just a storm. Sit down, all of you. We're not finished." But they were finished. Marie could feel it in her bones, in the way the air had changed from merely cold to something arctic and ancient. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from predatory to prey, though the men hadn't realized it yet. They were still operating under the assumption that they controlled this space, that their wealth and power made them untouchable. Lightning split the sky, and in that flash of white-blue light, Marie saw him. A figure stood outside the windows, which was impossible because they were 50 stories above the ground. He was tall, impossibly tall, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. His face was pale as marble, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, with features too perfect to be entirely human. Long dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his eyes, even at this distance, even through the glass, caught the lightning and held it, glowing with an inner luminescence that had nothing to do with reflection. He was looking directly at her. Marie's scream caught in her throat. She tried to point to warn the others, but her hand wouldn't move. The figure outside tilted his head, studying her with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Then he smiled, and Marie saw teeth that were just slightly too sharp, too white, too wrong. The lightning flashed again, and he was gone. "Did you see that?" Marie's voice came out as a whisper. "There was someone outside, a man." The silver-haired man laughed, the sound nervous. "We're 50 stories up. There's no one outside." But the windows continued to frost over, and now Marie could see shapes forming in the ice. Not random patterns, but deliberate designs. A crown, a chalice, a symbol that looked like a blood drop surrounded by thorns. The temperature continued to plummet until Marie's tears froze on her cheeks. "This isn't natural," the younger man said, backing away from the windows. "We need to leave, now." Eric's phone beeped, then beeped again, and again. All around the room, devices began to chime and vibrate in a discordant symphony. The men pulled out their phones, their tablets, their smart watches. Marie watched their faces change as they read whatever messages were flooding in. "The stream just cut out," the heavy-set man said, his voice tight. "And someone just placed a bet, a single bet, $10 million. "On what?" Eric demanded. "On all of them dying before midnight." The man looked up from his tablet, his face ashen. "The username is the king." The room went silent except for the howling wind outside. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs as the men exchanged glances that spoke of a fear they weren't accustomed to feeling. They were predators confronting something higher on the food chain, and their instincts were finally screaming what Marie's had been telling her for the past 20 minutes. "Run!" Thunder crashed again, so loud it rattled Marie's teeth. The lights in the penthouse flickered, died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the glow of phones and tablets and the strange luminescence coming through the frosted windows. In that half-light, Marie saw the reflection appear in the glass behind Eric. The man from outside, inside now, standing directly behind Eric Helborn with his hand raised as if to touch his shoulder. But no one had entered. No door had opened. He was simply there, as if he'd stepped through the glass itself like it was nothing more than water. The younger man's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering on the marble floor. "Behind you," he whispered to Eric. "There's someone behind you." Eric spun, and for the first time since Marie had known him, she saw genuine fear flash across his face. The figure stood less than a foot away, close enough that Eric should have felt his presence, his breath, his body heat. But there was no heat, only cold that radiated outward like waves. Up close, the man was even more striking. His skin held an alabaster quality that suggested he'd never seen sunlight, or perhaps hadn't needed to in a very long time. His eyes were dark, not brown or black, but something deeper, like looking into a well that had no bottom. He wore his suit with the kind of ease that came from centuries of practice, and there was something about the way he held himself, perfectly still, inhumanly still, that made Marie's hindbrain scream predator. "Good evening, gentlemen." His voice was soft, cultured, with an accent that belonged to no particular place or time. It was the voice of old libraries and older tombs, of things that had watched empires rise and fall. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." The silver-haired man found his voice first. "How did you get in here? This is a private floor. Security." "Security is sleeping." The man's smile widened fractionally. "They'll wake in a few hours with the worst headache of their lives and no memory of tonight." It seemed kinder than the alternative. He looked around the room, his gaze touching each man in turn before settling on Marie. "I heard there was entertainment happening here, a game of sorts. I do so enjoy games." Eric's hand moved toward his pocket, probably reaching for his phone or some panic button. The man's hand shot out faster than Marie's eyes could track, catching Eric's wrist with casual strength. "I wouldn't. You're already losing so badly. Don't make it worse." "Who the hell are you?" Eric tried to pull away and couldn't. The man's grip was immovable, inhuman. "I have many names. I've been called Monster, Savior, King, Devil, but you may call me Circean Sterling." He released Eric's wrist, and Eric stumbled backward, cradling his arm. "And I've come to teach you gentlemen something about real entertainment, about what happens when the game changes and you discover you were never the players at all." Circean's eyes found Marie's across the darkened room. "You were merely the audience." The wind outside rose to a shriek. The windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and ice, and the storm came flooding into the penthouse like a living thing. Marie screamed, throwing her arms up to protect her face, expecting to be shredded by the razor-sharp fragments. But nothing touched her. When she lowered her arms, she saw why. The glass hung suspended in the air around Circean, thousands of glittering shards frozen mid-flight, orbiting him like planets around a dark star. He stood at the center of the chaos, perfectly calm, his hand extended toward Marie in a gesture that was almost courtly. "You've suffered enough tonight, I think." His voice carried clearly despite the wind. "Come here, Marie Turner. Let me show you what it means to be truly valuable." Marie didn't move toward Circean's outstretched hand. Couldn't. Her body had locked in place, caught between the predators she knew and the predator she didn't. The glass still hung suspended in the air around him, thousands of razor edges glittering in the darkness like frozen stars. The wind howled through the shattered windows, but it moved around Circean as if he existed in a pocket of absolute stillness. Eric was the first to break. He lunged not toward the door but toward Marie, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. His fingers closed around her wrist with bruising force, yanking her half out of her chair. "You're not going anywhere. We have a contract. You're mine until I say otherwise." The glass stopped moving. Every shard, every fragment, every glittering piece froze completely in mid-orbit. The wind died. The temperature, already Arctic, dropped so low that Marie's next breath burned in her lungs. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Circean's head turned with mechanical precision toward Eric. His expression hadn't changed, still pleasant, still vaguely amused, but something in his eyes had gone flat and ancient and utterly devoid of mercy. "Yours," the word came out soft as silk. "Did you just claim ownership of a human being in front of a king?" Eric's grip on Marie loosened fractionally. "King, you're insane. Security will be here any minute and—" "Security is dreaming of their families." Saoirse moved, and the movement was wrong. Not a step, but a displacement, reality bending around him until he was simply there, directly in front of Eric, close enough that their faces were inches apart. Marie hadn't seen him cross the space. He just stopped being in one location and started being in another. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Hellborn. Do you know what true power smells like?" Eric tried to back away. Saoirse's hand landed on his shoulder, light as a feather, heavy as the grave. Eric's entire body went rigid, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure of himself. "It smells like centuries," Saoirse continued, his voice a whisper that somehow filled the entire penthouse. "Like blood that's been spilled in the name of kingdoms you've never heard of. Like the last breath of emperors and the tears of queens. It smells, Mr. Hellborn, like the moment you realize that all your money, all your power, all your carefully constructed cruelty means absolutely nothing to something older than your civilization." The other men had begun edging toward the door. Saoirse's eyes flicked toward them without moving his head, and they froze mid-step as if they'd been turned to stone. "No one leaves," Saoirse said pleasantly. "We haven't reached the interesting part yet." The younger man's phone buzzed. Then all their phones buzzed in unison, a discordant symphony of notification chimes. The heavyset man, still clutching his tablet, looked down at the screen. His face went gray. "The betting pool, it's changed. The categories are all different now." "Read them aloud," Saoirse commanded, still holding Eric in place with that gentle, terrible grip. "I want everyone to hear." The man's voice shook. "Time until first death, time until first begging, time until Eric Hellborn understands what he's done. Time until—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Continue," Saoirse said softly. "Time until the king feeds." The tablet slipped from his fingers, screen cracking against the marble. Saoirse's smile widened, revealing teeth that were indeed too sharp, too white, too perfectly designed for tearing flesh. "The audience does love their entertainment. I suppose we shouldn't disappoint them." Eric found his voice, though it came out strangled. "What are you?" "I am what lurks in the spaces between your nightmares and reality. I am what your ancestors warned you about in stories you dismissed as fairy tales. I am the reason your kind invented religion and built walls and learned to fear the dark." Saoirse leaned closer, his lips nearly touching Eric's ear. "But most relevantly, Mr. Hellborn, I am the king of a court that has watched your species since you first learned to make fire. And tonight, I have decided that I am very, very tired of watching men like you." Marie could see Eric trembling, could see the wet stains spreading across the front of his expensive slacks as his bladder released. The man who had orchestrated her humiliation, who had bet money on her suffering, who had treated her like a laboratory animal, was now reduced to a shaking, weeping thing held in place by a creature he couldn't begin to comprehend. "Please," Eric whispered. "Please, I have money. Whatever you want, name your price." Saoirse laughed, and the sound was beautiful and horrible all at once, like bells ringing in a cemetery. "Money, you think I want money?" He turned his head slightly, addressing the room. "Do you hear that, gentlemen? He's trying to buy his life, as if I were some common thing that could be purchased, as if I hadn't watched civilizations rise and fall while his family tree was still learning to walk upright." The silver-haired man had pressed himself against the far wall, as far from Saoirse as the room would allow. "What do you want?" "Justice," Saoirse said simply. "I want you to understand what you've done here tonight. I want you to feel what she felt." His eyes found Marie's again, and for a moment they softened with something that might have been pity. "This beautiful, broken creature you've been torturing for your amusement, do you have any idea what you had in your grasp?" "She's nobody," Eric gasped out. "She's just—" "Nobody." Saoirse's hand tightened on Eric's shoulder, and Eric screamed. Not from pain, though there was pain, from something worse.
from understanding flooding into his mind like poison, from every cruel thing he'd ever done playing back in his consciousness all at once. Marie could see it in his eyes, the realization of his own monstrosity reflected back at him in perfect, crystalline clarity. When Sertian released him, Eric collapsed to his knees, sobbing. I'm sorry, I didn't know, I didn't. You did know. Sertian's voice had gone cold as the void between stars. You simply didn't care. That's the difference between ignorance and evil, Mr. Hellborn, and you, all of you, chose evil because it entertained you. He turned to face the room, his back to Eric, apparently unconcerned about the threat a broken billionaire on his knees might pose. The glass shards began to move again, slowly rotating in their orbital pattern around him. I've been alive for 2,000 years. I've seen empires built on the backs of slaves. I've watched kings feed their subjects to lions. I've witnessed genocide and war and every horror humans can devise. But there's something particularly offensive about your brand of cruelty. You do it not for survival, not for territory, not even for passion. You do it because you're bored. The silver-haired man tried to speak, but Sertian held up a hand and his voice died in his throat. I'm not finished. You see, boredom is a privilege. It means you have everything you need and more. It means you've conquered every challenge, satisfied every appetite, accumulated more resources than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. And what do you do with that privilege? He gestured toward Marie. You turn human suffering into a spectator sport. Sertian moved toward Marie, the glass parting before him like water. He extended his hand again, closer now, close enough that she could see the alabaster perfection of his skin, the darkness of veins that no longer carried blood, the terrible, magnetic beauty of something that should not exist. Come here, Marie, he whispered, and this time his voice held no command, only invitation. Let me show them what happens when a king takes interest in someone they declared worthless. Behind him, Eric was still on his knees, still weeping. The other men had begun to realize that the door would not save them, that whatever Sertian Sterling was, he had already decided their fate before entering this room. The whisper came next, so soft that Marie almost missed it. Sertian spoke without turning, without raising his voice, addressing Eric with the casual intimacy of an executioner and his condemned. Kneel, Sertian said. And every man in the room dropped to their knees, as if their strings had been cut.
They knelt like penitents before an altar, heads bowed, bodies trembling. Marie watched from her chair, still frozen in place, as 6 of the world's most powerful men were reduced to supplicants by a single whispered word. The glass shards continued their slow orbit around Sertian, catching what little light remained and throwing it across the walls in dancing shadows. Sertian walked among them with the leisure of a curator in a museum, examining each man as if they were artifacts of a failed civilization. He stopped in front of the silver-haired man, tilting his head in consideration. Lawrence Cartwright, Sertian said, and the man flinched at his own name. Hedge fund manager, net worth $4.3 billion. You made your fortune shorting companies during the financial crisis, putting 12,000 families out of their homes. When asked about it in an interview, you said it was just business. Sertian crouched down, forcing Lawrence to meet his eyes. Tell me, Mr. Cartwright, did their suffering entertain you, or were you simply indifferent? Lawrence's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Sertian didn't wait for an answer. He moved to the younger man, who was quietly weeping into his hands. Marcus Chen, tech entrepreneur. You built an app that gamified debt collection, turning human desperation into a point system for your users. The suicide rate among your targets increased by 37% in the first year. Sertian's voice remained conversational, almost pleasant. Innovation, you called it. Disruption. As if giving cruelty a modern interface made it less monstrous. He continued around the circle, naming each man, cataloging their sins with the precision of someone who'd been watching for a very long time. The heavyset man had embezzled pension funds. Another had run a pharmaceutical company that deliberately inflated insulin prices. Each revelation hung in the air like an indictment, and Marie realized that Sertian hadn't just stumbled upon this gathering. He'd known exactly who would be here. He'd chosen this moment with the same careful precision Eric had used to orchestrate her humiliation. Finally, Sertian returned to Eric, who remained on his knees with his head bowed, shoulders shaking. And you, Eric Hellborn, the architect of tonight's entertainment. Tell me, how did you describe it to your audience? Your exclusive subscribers who paid to watch this young woman be destroyed. Eric's voice came out broken. Authentic human experience, raw emotion, the truth of power dynamics in modern society. Poetry, Saoirsean's tone dripped with contempt. You dressed up sadism in academic language and charged admission, how very civilized. He turned away from Eric, addressing the room as if conducting a lecture. Do you want to know what offends me most about your little game? It's not the cruelty. I've seen worse cruelty. I've participated in worse cruelty. I've orchestrated the fall of kingdoms and the death of bloodlines. I am not, by any measure, a good creature. He moved back toward Marie, his movements fluid and predatory. What offends me is how crude it all is, how lacking in artistry. You didn't even try to make it beautiful. Saoirsean gestured at the obsidian table, the expensive wine, the minimalist decor. You thought the trappings of wealth would elevate your game, make it sophisticated, but it's just torture with better lighting. Marie found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. What are you? Saoirsean turned to her, and his expression softened into something almost human. I am Saoirsean Sterling, born Saoirsean Valois in the year 43 of the Common Era. I was made into this. He gestured at himself, during the reign of Claudius, when Rome still believed itself eternal. I am what your species calls vampire, though that word carries so much superstitious baggage. I prefer to think of myself as an apex predator who has developed, over 2 millennia, something approaching a conscience. He sat on the edge of the table, casual despite the kneeling men and the supernatural display surrounding them. I have played games with human lives, Marie, real games. I've seduced queens and toppled dynasties. I've turned political rivals against each other with a whispered word and watched nations tear themselves apart for my amusement. I've made art from manipulation, symphonies from suffering. When a true king plays with lives, there is elegance to it, purpose, a kind of terrible beauty. Saoirsean's gaze swept across the kneeling men with disdain. But this, recording a woman's breakdown for an audience of wealthy voyeurs, betting on her tears like she's a racehorse, it's pedestrian, artless. It's the kind of cruelty that requires no imagination, no skill. You didn't even break her yourselves. You outsourced it to her own memories and called it entertainment. Please, Lawrence whispered. We'll stop. We'll never do it again. Just let us go. Oh, you'll never do it again. Saoirsean's smile was cold and sharp. That much I can promise, but letting you go, that would defeat the purpose of this teachable moment. He stood, moving back into the center of the room, the glass shards accelerating in their orbit around him. You see, I've grown tired of watching. For centuries, I've observed your species from the shadows, interfering only when it suited my interests. I told myself that human cruelty was not my concern, that you were free to devour each other as you pleased. The wind outside picked up again, howling through the shattered windows. Saoirsean's voice rose above it, taking on a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Marie's chest. But there comes a point when observation becomes complicity, when silence becomes consent. And tonight, watching Mr. Hellborn torture this young woman while you all placed your bets, I realized I had reached that point. He turned to Eric, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. You wanted to play a game, Eric. You wanted to demonstrate your power, show your audience how utterly you controlled another human being. So let me show you what a real game looks like. Let me demonstrate the difference between your crude theatrics and true power. Saoirsean extended his hand, and one of the glass shards detached from its orbit. It hung in the air between him and Eric, slowly rotating, catching the light. I'm going to give you a choice. A real choice, not the false options you gave Marie. You can keep your life or you can keep your empire. Choose. Eric looked up, confusion cutting through his terror. What? Your life or your fortune. You can walk out of here tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back and the knowledge that you survived. Or you can die here now, and your wealth will be distributed to every person your companies have harmed. Every employee you've exploited, every user you've manipulated, every victim of your entertainment will receive compensation from the Hellborn estate. Saoirsean's smile widened. See, that's a proper game, one where the stakes are real and the choice actually matters. That's not a choice, Eric said desperately. That's extortion. No, Mr. Hellborn, what you did to Marie was extortion. This is judgment. Saoirse gestured, and the glass shard moved closer to Eric's throat. And you have 10 seconds to decide. Choose wisely. A true king's patience has limits. The room held its breath. Marie watched Eric's face cycle through emotions. Fear, anger, calculation, and finally, the awful realization that his money could not save him. That for the first time in his life, he faced a power that cared nothing for his wealth. I choose, Eric began, but Saoirse held up a hand. Wait, before you answer, let me show you one more thing. Saoirse moved toward Marie, his hand extended once more. Let me show you what you had and threw away. Let me show you what real value looks like. He took Marie's hand, and the world changed. When Saoirse's hand touched Marie's, warmth flooded through her for the first time since entering the penthouse. Not physical warmth, but something deeper, something that pushed back against the crushing weight of shame and worthlessness that had been suffocating her all night. She gasped, her vision blurring, and suddenly she could see herself the way he saw her, not as broken but as survived, not as worthless but as enduring. Every scar, every wound, every moment of suffering transformed from weakness into proof of strength. It lasted only a heartbeat, but when Saoirse released her hand, Marie found she could breathe again. You see, Saoirse said softly, though his words were directed at Eric. She has survived more cruelty in 26 years than you've witnessed in your entire privileged existence. That kind of resilience is rare, precious, and you tried to destroy it for entertainment. Marcus Chen broke first. The young tech entrepreneur lurched to his feet and ran for the door, his expensive shoes skidding on the marble floor. He made it 3 steps before Saoirse moved. Not walked, not ran, moved. Reality bent around him, and suddenly he was standing in Marcus's path, his hand pressed gently against the man's chest. I didn't say you could leave, Saoirse said. Marcus swung wildly, his fist aimed at Saoirse's face. The blow never landed. Saoirse caught his wrist mid-swing, and the sound of bones breaking was audible across the room. Marcus screamed, dropping to his knees, cradling his shattered arm. That was unwise, Saoirse observed. But I appreciate the attempt. At least you tried to fight instead of simply cowering. He looked down at Marcus with something almost resembling respect. You're still going to die, of course, but with slightly more dignity than I'd expected. Lawrence Cartwright scrambled toward the broken windows, perhaps thinking he could climb down or signal for help. Saoirse didn't even look at him. The glass shards still orbiting the room suddenly changed trajectory, streaking through the air with the precision of guided missiles. They caught Lawrence mid-stride, dozens of them piercing his legs, his arms, his torso. Not killing blows, pinning blows. Lawrence collapsed, impaled against the floor like a butterfly mounted in a collection. His screams were high and thin, the sound of a man who'd never experienced real pain before. You're not leaving either, Saoirse said conversationally. None of you are. This is a closed game, gentlemen. Only one winner, and it's not going to be any of you. The heavy-set man lunged toward Marie, perhaps thinking he could use her as leverage or hostage. He never reached her. A wall of frozen air materialized between them, solid as steel, and he bounced off it with enough force to crack his nose. Blood streamed down his face as he staggered backward. Marie realized she was sitting inside a sphere of protection, an invisible barrier that separated her from the carnage beginning to unfold. She could feel it humming against her skin, cold but not unpleasant, like standing in the shadow of something vast and ancient. Through it, she watched what happened next with the detached clarity of someone observing a nightmare that couldn't touch her. The remaining board members broke in different directions, their expensive suits and polished veneers stripped away to reveal the animal panic underneath. One made it to the elevator and frantically pressed the call button, but the doors wouldn't open. Another tried to use his phone to call for help, but the device crumbled to dust in his hand. Saoirse had severed all connections to the outside world. The penthouse had become a sealed tomb. You wanted to play God, Saoirse said, his voice echoing through the chaos. You wanted to control another person's fate, decide when they would break and how. Let me show you what it feels like when a real God takes interest. He moved among them like death itself, elegant and inevitable. The man at the elevator turned just as Sertian appeared behind him. No dramatic gesture, no flourish. Sertian simply placed his hand on the man's shoulder, and the man went rigid. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and then he crumpled like a puppet with cut strings, dead before he hit the floor. "Heart attack," Sertian explained to no one in particular. "I stopped it, quite painless, really, more mercy than he deserved." Marcus tried to crawl toward the door, his broken arm dragging uselessly. Sertian let him get halfway there before appearing in his path again. "Where are you going, Mr. Chen? We haven't finished our discussion about your innovation." He crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the terrified man. "Do you know what happens when you gamify human suffering? When you turn debt and desperation into points on a screen, you divorce yourself from the consequences. You forget that every number represents a person." "I'm sorry," Marcus sobbed. "I didn't think—" "You didn't think they were real," Sertian finished. "You thought they were abstractions, data points, but they were real, Mr. Chen, as real as you, and now you're discovering what it feels like to be reduced to an abstraction yourself." Sertian's hand shot out, faster than thought, and Marcus's screaming stopped. Just stopped. His body remained upright for a moment before toppling sideways, his eyes still open but seeing nothing. Lawrence, still pinned by glass shards, was whimpering now, begging in a voice made small by terror. "Please, please, I have children, a family." "So did the people you destroyed," Sertian said, walking toward him with measured steps. "But their families didn't interest you when you were foreclosing on their homes. Their children didn't matter when you were counting your profits." He knelt beside Lawrence, studying him the way a scientist might study an insect. "Tell me, Mr. Cartwright, did you ever lose sleep over what you'd done? Did you ever question whether your wealth was worth the cost?" Lawrence's answer was lost in renewed screaming as Sertian slowly, methodically, pulled each glass shard free. Not to release him, but to catalog his pain. To demonstrate exactly what Marie had endured, magnified, and made physical. Within her protective sphere, Marie watched. She knew she should feel horror, revulsion, something, but all she felt was a terrible, hollow satisfaction. These men had made a game of her suffering, had bet money on her tears, had treated her humanity as disposable entertainment. Now they were learning the cost of that game, paid in full. The boardroom had transformed into an abattoir. Blood pooled on the expensive marble, spreading in dark rivulets toward the shattered windows. Bodies lay crumpled in unnatural positions. The air reeked of copper and fear and something else, something older and darker that Marie couldn't name. Through it all, Sertian remained immaculate. Not a drop of blood stained his suit. Not a hair fell out of place. He moved through the carnage with the grace of a dancer, orchestrating death with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. Only Eric and the heavyset man remained alive, huddled together near the bar, their faces ashen with the certain knowledge of their approaching end. Sertian turned toward them, and his smile was beautiful and terrible. "Now then," he said, his voice cutting through their sobbing. "Where were we? Ah, yes. Eric was about to make a choice." He glanced at Marie, and his expression softened. "What do you think, my dear? Should I give him the chance to choose, or has he already demonstrated what his answer would be?" Marie's voice came out steady, surprising even herself. "He would choose his money. Men like him always do." "Perceptive," Sertian said approvingly. "Then perhaps we should skip ahead to the interesting part." He moved toward Eric with terrible purpose, and Marie watched through her shield of safety as the king of vampires prepared to deliver his final judgment. Eric Hellborn had built an empire on understanding human psychology, on knowing exactly which buttons to press to extract maximum engagement, maximum profit, maximum pain. He'd studied behavioral patterns and neural responses, had hired the best minds in manipulation and persuasion. He knew how to break people because he'd made a science of it. None of that prepared him for what Sertian Sterling did next. The vampire king moved toward Eric with the unhurried pace of inevitability itself. The heavy-set man beside Eric tried to run, managed 2 shambling steps before his heart simply stopped. He fell forward, dead before he struck the marble, leaving Eric alone in the wreckage of his game. "Just us now," Saoirse said, settling into the chair Eric had occupied at the beginning of the evening. The chair where he'd sat with his phone recording Marie's breakdown, where he'd orchestrated her humiliation with the casual cruelty of a bored god. Fitting, don't you think? The architect and his judge, a nice symmetry to it. Eric's back pressed against the bar, his hands scrambling for anything that might serve as a weapon. His fingers closed around a bottle of wine, the same vintage he'd poured for Marie hours ago. He swung it at Saoirse's head with desperate strength. Saoirse caught the bottle without looking, plucked it from Eric's grip as easily as taking a toy from a child. $30,000 wine. Shade Hamargox, 1947. You served this to Marie while you were torturing her. Did you think the expensive setting made your cruelty sophisticated? He examined the label with academic interest. Do you know what I was doing in 1947, Eric? I was in Berlin, watching a different kind of monster face judgment. The tribunals were crude by my standards, but at least they had the honesty to call evil by its name. You're insane, Eric whispered. You're a monster. Yes, Saoirse agreed pleasantly. I am. I've never pretended otherwise. But the difference between us, Mr. Hellborn, is that I own what I am. I don't dress my cruelty in innovation. I don't monetize suffering and call it content. I don't hide behind corporate language and user engagement metrics. He set the bottle down gently on the bar. I am a predator. You are something worse. You're a predator who convinced himself he was civilized. Saoirse's hand shot out, gripping Eric's face with fingers that felt like marble. Eric tried to scream, but no sound emerged. His eyes went wide with sudden, overwhelming terror as Saoirse's power flooded into him. Marie watched from her protective sphere as Eric's expression transformed. She saw the moment Saoirse forced him to feel everything Marie had felt tonight. The shame, the helplessness, the crushing realization that he was nothing more than entertainment for creatures who viewed him as less than human. Every tear she'd shed, every moment of humiliation, every second of degradation poured into Eric's consciousness like acid. But Saoirse didn't stop there. He went deeper, forcing Eric to experience the suffering of everyone he'd ever harmed, every employee he'd exploited, every user he'd manipulated, every person who'd been destroyed by his platforms, his games, his endless appetite for engagement at any cost. Decades of accumulated pain channeled directly into Eric's mind in the space of heartbeats. Eric's body convulsed. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, turning the whites crimson. Tears and snot streamed down his face as his brain struggled to process the impossible weight of collective suffering. He was drowning in the pain he'd inflicted, choking on the consequences he'd never bothered to consider. This is what you sold, Saoirse said softly. This is what you packaged and distributed and profited from. Human agony, refined and concentrated and turned into a product for consumption. You made billions from it, Eric, billions, and you never once felt an ounce of it yourself. Saoirse released him, and Eric collapsed to the floor, curled into a fetal position, sobbing with a desperation that went beyond words. He wasn't begging for mercy anymore. He was begging for it to stop, for the terrible understanding to leave him, for the ignorance that had let him sleep peacefully at night to return. Please, he finally managed, the word broken and raw. Please make it stop. I can't bear it. Now you understand, Saoirse said, crouching beside him. Now you know what Marie Turner has carried every day of her life. The weight of being powerless in a world run by people like you. The exhaustion of being treated as disposable. The grief of watching your mother die while men in expensive suits decide whether her life is worth the cost of treatment. He tilted his head, studying Eric with clinical detachment. How does it feel, Mr. Hellborn? Is it entertaining? I'm sorry, Eric wept. I'm sorry. I know you are. You're feeling genuine remorse for the first time in your life. Unfortunately for you, remorse changes nothing. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't erase the trauma you've inflicted. Saoirse reached down, lifting Eric's chin so their eyes met. You asked me earlier what I wanted. I told you justice. But there's something you should understand about justice, Eric. It's not rehabilitation. It's not redemption. Sometimes justice is simply consequence. Eric's mouth opened, perhaps to beg again, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to offer one final plea for the mercy he'd never shown others. Sertian didn't give him the chance. His hand moved with supernatural speed, gripping Eric's throat. Not strangling, something worse. Marie saw Eric's expression change one final time. The terror drained away, replaced by a blank, distant look. His eyes remained open but vacant, as if the person behind them had simply departed. Sertian held him there for a long moment, and Marie understood that he was taking something more than life. He was taking Eric's death itself, controlling even the final moment, ensuring that Eric Hellborn's last conscious thought was the understanding of exactly what he'd been and what he'd done. When Sertian finally released him, Eric's body slumped to the floor with the finality of a closed book. Dead. Completely. Irrevocably. No dramatic flourish. No cinematic moment. Just the quiet cessation of a life that had caused immeasurable harm. Sertian stood, brushing imaginary dust from his immaculate suit. He looked around the boardroom at the bodies scattered like discarded props, at the blood painting abstract patterns on the marble, at the shattered windows through which the storm still raged. Then his eyes found Marie, still protected within her sphere of safety, and his expression gentled. "It's over," he said simply. "The game is finished, you won." Marie stared at him, at this creature who'd slaughtered 6 men without breaking a sweat, who turned a high-rise boardroom into a charnel house, who delivered justice with the precision of a surgeon and the brutality of an ancient king. She should have been terrified, should have been scrambling to escape, to get as far from this monster as possible. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "Why did you do this?" Sertian moved toward her, and the protective barrier dissolved at his approach. He extended his hand, the same gesture he'd made several times throughout the night, but this time there was no urgency to it, just an offer, a choice freely given. "Because I'm tired of watching," he said. "Because I've spent 2 millennia observing human cruelty and telling myself it wasn't my concern. Because tonight, when I saw what they were doing to you, I realized that indifference had made me complicit in every evil I'd witnessed." He smiled, sad and ancient. "And because, Marie Turner, you deserve to see your tormentors face consequences. You deserve to know that your suffering mattered to someone." Marie looked at his outstretched hand, at the blood on the floor, at the broken windows and the storm beyond, at the bodies of men who'd tried to break her and had been broken themselves. She took his hand. Marie's hand remained in Sertian's as he led her through the carnage, past bodies that had been billionaires hours ago, past blood that had once flowed through veins that pulsed with power and privilege. Her cheap heels clicked against marble slick with the evidence of justice, and she found that her hands had stopped shaking. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving tracks of salt and something harder beneath. The storm outside had begun to calm, as if it had only existed to herald Sertian's arrival and was no longer needed. Through the shattered windows, the city's lights were flickering back to life, section by section, restoring the illusion of civilization. But Marie had seen behind that illusion now, had seen what lurked in penthouses and boardrooms, in places where enough money bought the right to treat people as disposable. She'd also seen what hunted those hunters. "Look at them," Sertian said, gesturing at the bodies with casual elegance. "The world's elite, the ones who shaped policy and moved markets and decided which lives had value. They built empires on the backs of people like you, Marie. They fed on suffering because they could, because no one had the power to stop them." He turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the returning city lights. "Until tonight." Marie's gaze moved from corpse to corpse. Lawrence Cartwright, who'd foreclosed on 12,000 homes. Marcus Chen, whose app had driven people to suicide. The others, each carrying their own ledger of harm. Eric Hellborn, crumpled near the bar, his face frozen in an expression of understanding that had come too late to save him. "I should feel something," Marie said quietly. "Guilt, horror, remorse, but I don't, I just feel." She searched for the word. "Free," Sertian supplied. "You feel free because the weight of their judgment has been lifted, because the people who made you feel worthless have been proven worthless themselves, because for the first time in your life, you've witnessed justice that actually served you rather than serving power." He was right. Marie felt hollowed out but not empty, cleansed but not clean. Something fundamental had shifted inside her during the past hour, some core understanding of how the world actually worked. The social contract was a lie. The powerful preyed on the weak not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And the only thing that stopped them was encountering something more powerful. Something like Saoirse and Sterling. "What happens now?" Marie asked. "The police will come, there will be investigations, evidence." "There will be a gas leak," Saoirse said calmly. "A tragic accident during a late-night business meeting. The penthouse's security footage will show nothing useful, and the building's records will indicate a mechanical failure in the climate control systems. 6 wealthy men died of carbon monoxide poisoning while discussing investments. Tragic, but explainable." He smiled slightly. "I've been cleaning up messes for 2,000 years, Marie. I know how to make inconvenient truths disappear." "And me?" Marie looked down at herself, at the black dress that Eric had made her feel ashamed of, at the hands that had trembled while signing a contract that was meant to be her execution. "What happens to me?" Saoirse's expression grew serious, the weight of centuries settling into his features. "That depends on what you want. I can return you to your life. Arrange for your mother's treatment to be fully funded through an anonymous donor. Give you enough money to start over somewhere new, far from the memories of tonight. You can go back to being human, to living a normal life, and this night will fade into something you'll eventually convince yourself was a trauma-induced hallucination." He paused, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Or you can accept what you've already begun to understand, that the world is divided between predators and prey, and the only real choice is which one you want to be." Marie's heart beat faster. "What are you offering?" "Everything Eric promised and more. Power, wealth, the ability to never be helpless again. I'm offering you a place at my side, Marie Turner, not as a victim I rescued, but as something more." Saoirse moved closer, and his presence filled the space between them like gravity. "I can make you like me, immortal, powerful, free from the limitations of human fragility. You would never again have to watch helplessly while the people you love suffer. You would never again be at the mercy of men who see you as entertainment." The offer hung in the air between them, glittering with dark promise. Marie thought of her mother, dying in a hospital bed. Thought of every moment she'd felt powerless, every time she'd been invisible, every instance where she'd been treated as less than human. She thought of the look on Eric's face when Saoirse had forced him to understand what he'd done. The terror, the helplessness, the crushing realization that he was nothing more than a thing to be used. "What's the cost?" Marie asked, because nothing this valuable came without a price. "Your humanity," Saoirse said simply. "Not your compassion or your capacity for feeling. Those remain sharper and deeper than you can imagine. But your human limitations, your mortality, your place in the world of prey. You would become a predator, Marie. You would feed on blood to survive. You would watch everyone you've known grow old and die while you remain unchanged. You would live in the shadows of human society, always apart from it, always other." He took her hand again, his skin cool against hers. "And you could never look back, never regret the choice, never mourn the human life you left behind. Because if you do, if you cling to what you were, it will drive you mad. I've seen it happen to those who couldn't let go. They become monsters not because of what they are, but because of what they refuse to stop being." Marie looked around the penthouse one final time, at the wealth that had bought nothing but death, at the power that had proven impotent against something truly powerful, at the elite who'd learned too late that the top of the food chain was an illusion. She thought about going back to her studio apartment, to her dying mother, to her job at a company that would replace her within a week. To the world where people like her were disposable, where suffering was entertainment, where crying was worth $10,000 to someone behind a camera. She thought about never being helpless again. "If I say yes," Marie said slowly, "if I accept this, what would I become? What would I do with immortality and power?" Saoirse's smile was approving, as if she'd asked exactly the right question. "Whatever you want. Hunt those who prey on the weak. Build empires that treat people as valuable. Use your immortality to ensure that what happened to you tonight never happens to anyone else. Or simply exist, watching centuries unfold, taking what you need and owing nothing to anyone." He gestured at the bodies around them. "The difference between them and us, Marie, is that we would choose to be better. Not because we have to, but because we can. Marie closed her eyes, saw her mother's face, saw the hospital bills, saw Eric's smile as he'd recorded her tears, saw Saoirsean's hand delivering justice that human systems never would. When she opened her eyes again, something had hardened in them, something that would never soften. "I don't want to be prey anymore," she said. "I don't want to watch people suffer because they don't have enough money to be considered human. I don't want to be invisible. I don't want to be disposable." She met Saoirsean's ancient gaze with newfound steel. "Make me like you, make me powerful, and then help me make sure no one else has to endure what I endured." Saoirsean's smile widened, revealing those perfect, terrible teeth. "Then welcome to the new reign, Marie Turner. Welcome to immortality." He pulled her close, his lips near her throat. "This will hurt. Transformation always does. But when it's over, you'll never be helpless again." Marie tilted her head, offering her neck, and felt Saoirsean's fangs pierce her skin. Pain flooded through her, bright and terrible and somehow right. As her human blood flowed out and something ancient flowed in, Marie Turner died. And something else, something powerful and eternal and utterly unbreakable, was born in her place. If you stayed until the end, it's because some part of you knows this wasn't just a story. It was a warning. Subscribe, because stories like this only matter if people are still listening. And if you don't want to live in a world where suffering is entertainment, stay here,